So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Mueller. I'm the CEO of Valley Vision, and we're very happy to be with you today. And I'm glad that we have set aside time on our very busy day to have a conversation about water. So this is sort of the interactive portion of our program. I'm going to invite our panelists to come join us here at the front, and we have a couple of preset questions. I'm going to be asking those questions. As you entered, you received a 3x5 card. Because we have a lot of people, we would like you to write down what your questions are for the panel. Because we may not be able to get to every question, we're going to ask you to write your email address in the corner so that if we don't get to that question today, that we're able to follow up with you. So does everybody have their 3x5 card? Okay, so please be thinking about those questions. Our staff is going to sort of filter through the room, and we'll grab those cards, and then we'll submit it to the panel for their response. So we're going to lead off with an introduction of each of our panelists, and then a set of questions. And again, we hope to leave at least half of the portion of our time for your response. So we're going to begin with Andy Fecko. Andy is the Director of Resource Development for the Placer County Water Agency. He oversees the Resource Development Team, who are responsible for regulatory affairs, compliance, legislative advocacy, energy sales, and a broad array of special projects that affect the utility and the business interests of the agency. Andy has a degree from UC Davis in conservation biology and has been in the water and energy business for about 15 years now. So please join me in welcoming Andy Fecko. So next on our panel is Fritz Durst. He is the president of the Board of Trustees of RD 108, the president of the Sykes Reservoir JPA, and the chairman of the Northern California Water Association's Water Management Task Force. He's a farmer raising many different crops, and he was careful to tell us that he uses drip, sprinkler, furrow, and flood irrigation techniques, but the majority of his farming acres are rainfall only. So let's welcome Fritz to the program. So next in the lineup is Jay Ziegler. He's the Director of External Affairs for the Nature Conservancy. Jay oversees the California chapter's engagements with governments and other stakeholders at the state, county, and regional levels. Prior to joining the Conservancy, Jay founded and was principal of Ziegler Associates, a public affairs firm focusing on environmental issues, land use, regulatory matters, and clean technology. He also served previously as senior counselor to policymakers in Sacramento and in Washington, D.C., including working for Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt in the Clinton administration, where he dealt with policy coordination on a number of complex natural resource issues. So please join me in welcoming Jay. And then our fourth panelist is Jim Earp of the California Alliance for Jobs, which is a business labor partnership that represents 1,700 contractors in the heavy construction industry and 80,000 union workers they employ through Northern and Central California. He was appointed to serve on the California Transportation Commission in 2007 and again in 2011 for a 4-year term. Under Jim's leadership, the Alliance has become a strong advocate for solving the state's transportation investment problems, investment in state housing, and also meeting California's water needs. Jim has been an outspoken proponent for job growth and wise infrastructure investment. So please join me in welcoming Jim Earp. So I'm going to start off with Andy. And Andy, you've been working with Jim Pfeiffer and a number of experts who are part of the North State Water Alliance, working to document the infrastructure, the operational requirements, the regulatory needs that the North State needs for sort of a long-term solution to our water woes. And we're sort of thinking about it as a 30-year water blueprint. Can you tell us what the components of that sort of emerging solution, what it looks like, and why those components matter?
Sure. Hopefully this is on.
Yeah.
Hopefully this is on. So let me start with.
I think if you hold it just a little bit farther away from you, there you go.
There we go. So let's start with Susan Roman mentioned it, the solution in 3 parts. So as we found ourselves at the tail end of 2013, the state of California released a plan for their Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And one of the most interesting facets of that plan for us was that the state's climate is changing. We all sort of knew that. For the first time, the state had actually documented what that meant for the future. And that got our attention. It was extremely interesting, not only for the Bay Delta region, but also for all the upstream regions. And we thought that's interesting. We got Folsom Lake, for instance, going dry 1 year out of 9 or 10. Well, that got our attention, certainly. Problem was we found ourselves living that scenario, which was supposed to happen far off into the future, as we came out of 2013 and we're going into 2014. So that focused our minds tremendously. And it really got us thinking, particularly as a region in the American River Basin, but also the entire Sacramento Valley, about, well, what does it take to survive something like that? If this is truly our future, how do we get to water supply reliability for our people, our farms, and for our local environment in a way that benefits not only the North State, but also as part of the statewide solution. So yeah, Jim Pfeiffer, myself, and a lot of other folks, some of which are in the room here today, started working on the kinds of infrastructure, for instance, that the Sacramento region needs, which focused tremendously on increasing our wise use of water, the conservation aspects of it, really taking to heart some of the things that Southern California has done, frankly, and applying them to this area, and really finishing the job that was started back in 2000 with the water farm. So conservation is a big part of our story. There's a lot to be done. Local agencies here are making that investment currently and will continue to make that investment going forward. But there are other concrete things that are really centered around the diversification of our supplies, really accelerating our conjunctive use program, which is the use of surface water in wet years when there's plenty of water, for instance, coming through Folsom Lake, and switching to groundwater in drier years. That program exists in this region. The problem is that the various entities, I think there's about 22 different agencies that run water as part of the Regional Water Authority, are not well connected together. They're connected together for emergency purposes, physically interconnected together. But they're not well connected together so that you can use groundwater in one area, say all the way out by the Sacramento River, and that'll have an effect on, say, how the city of Folsom is able to access Folsom water. So those kinds of regional interconnections, they're not inexpensive, they're difficult. You're talking about building things in an already built environment, but they're very important. And lastly, I think that from a diversification standpoint, this region, the North State, you're going to hear Fritz talk a little bit about Sites Reservoir. I'm certain for us, our big infrastructure project, I'll give you an interesting fact. There's 13 major water treatment plants in the Sacramento region. 11 of them rely on American River water. 11. And the American River is one of the most stressed systems in the state as far as having competing demands. So as we look towards our future, the 30-year plan, the diversification is going to come from the very important conjunctive use aspects, but also moving some of our demands onto other river systems, particularly the Sacramento River, so we can be flexible. Groundwater, Sacramento River water, American River water, as conditions demand. And I think that that's sort of the broad view. There's a lot of detail behind that, and we're working very hard to develop those plans. As you know, those things are not easy to come to fine detail on, but those are the tracks that we're working on very hard as not only regional water purveyors, but cities and counties that rely on that water.
Okay. So Andy, we're going to come back to you, but we're going to go next to Fritz. So Fritz, you run a farm. This has been a tough time. What are the changes that you have needed to implement? What's your sort of near-term forecast for how your farming operation has been impacted? And then I do want to ask you about the Sites Reservoir.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Probably pretty well without this. So I farm in several different regions, and as Bill kind of pointed out earlier, to the west in the Yolo County, I'm in a region that's, we have surface water from Clear Lake and Indian Valley Reservoir. We also, and that supply of water is typically unreliable. We'll have a drought out there every 6th year, 7th year. So what's happened in the region is we've done the conjunctive use that we've heard about here. We have wells to back up our surface supply, but we are now being challenged by the fact that the groundwater system is being taxed more so than it used to be. It used to be only used in those drought years. And what's happened is some of the growers have planted permanent crops, find it's much more reliable for them just to go straight on the groundwater, so it's an annual use of the water. We don't have any problems yet, but all we have to do is look south of the delta, and we can see what's coming down the pipe. So that's that one region over there. The other region I farm is near the Sacramento River for RD 108, and the Board of Trustees there has been very, very proactive over decades. We've reduced our water demand off of the river probably 33% in 70 years. It started with cutting a deal with the Bureau of Reclamation over the Shasta Reservoir, and we got some certainty for our water supply, but on the other hand, we had to take a cut in the amount of water we could divert. Our district then went into the early 70s and we implemented extensive recycling, and we have reduced our water consumption by another 25%. And basically that 25% was the increment that we could lose on a dry year such as this. So that was the board's solution, was to conserve water. Well, I'll kind of roll into Sites Reservoir at the same time. I first got on the board in the 90s, and the general manager, Lou Hins, at that point came forth and said, hey, we need to get the Sites Reservoir thing rolling. It's been talked about for decades. And our old board said, well, why do we need that? And he said, someday we're going to need alternative sources of water. Well, here we are today. But we continue the recycling in that region right there, and we've taken probably another 3 or 4%. We did a study last year in terms of water efficiency. I mean, now we're primarily rice, and we're 92% efficient. I don't think anybody in the San Joaquin Valley can even come close to that, even with their drip irrigation. And I'm really proud to say that in our region, it's more than just water applied for rice and for tomatoes. It's also, there's a lot of wildlife out there that uses that water as well. So we're getting multi-benefits for that water. On the Sites Reservoir, I'll roll right into that. So 7 different agencies in Northern California have formed a JPA. Colusa County, Glenn County, Reclamation District 108, the Glen Colusa Irrigation District, Maxwell Irrigation District, I'm forgetting what, and the Yolo County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, all form this JPA to advance the project. And our goal, our short-term goal, was to figure out whether this project was going to be affordable. Not feasible, but affordable. The federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation and DWR have been studying this project for decades and never had an answer. They couldn't come up with feasibility, number one. We are currently working on affordability. That's going to be a big issue. The state bond is coming up here, and if half of the reservoir's benefits are for public, well then the bond, it would be eligible for bond funding. And I think Sites is going to tee up really well for that, for being able to use some of those funds. The reservoir itself holds 1.8 million acre feet. That's if you fill it up to the top. The annual yield is about a little less than 500,000 acre feet. And that water will primarily come from the ephemeral streams below Shasta. So if you all have seen here recently when the Sacramento River rises up, that's not from outflow from Shasta, that's from Cottonwood Creek, Stony Creek, all these. So they'll be able to capture some of that water there. There will be times when water has to be released in the winter months for salmon egg masses up below Keswick, and there's limited demand at that point, so the water pretty much was going out the Golden Gate. That water could be captured, put into Sites Reservoir as well. Sites Reservoir is kind of it should be thought of as a water efficiency project as well. As we all, as cities, have to become more efficient with water, farmers have been trying to become more efficient with water. You know, we've been working with the Nature Conservancy about how we can make some of our environmental water more efficient as well. We have a limited supply here. So 500,000 acre-feet is what annually could be contributed. I could see here with Folsom, some of the water that has to be released from Folsom for obligations in the Delta that perhaps come out of the site's reservoir.
All right. Thanks, Fritz. So we're going to move on to Jay. So Jay, we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about climate change. So climate change has been behind a lot of new state rulemaking, or at least proposed planning. To what extent is the state of California really addressing this issue, and how is its regulatory framework shifting, and how can we prepare for that?
I'll try this word. It works.
It does. You might have to hold it just a little bit farther away.
All right. Bill, I think it's a really important question, and a lot of the time in California the focus goes to AB 32 and the implementation of AB 32. And I actually want to set that aside for just a second, because I think that in the big picture, what we're really learning about climate change is that we're going to get more rain when we don't want it and less rain when we do. And we've got to prepare our system with that kind of resiliency in mind. And so it's really going to require a whole lot more creativity and working across multiple interests to actually make any progress in a meaningful way in saying that we're addressing climate change challenges in front of us. And I think that we're just beginning to get a grasp of this, and to quote Rahm Emanuel's famous line, it would be a shame if we let this crisis go to waste. And I think that all of us...
That was Winston Churchill.
I'll put it in a contemporary.
Good line that's got many office.
That's right. So I just think that we really are just beginning to test how we're going to respond to this drought. And I think that we would all benefit working together in the Capitol to make sure that the impacts of this drought in terms of water management flexibility, management of our reservoirs, integrated big picture water resource management, and how those decisions then affect fish and how they affect migratory birds is also really important. I think we pride ourselves as an organization in trying to be a solution finder out there, to work with all interest groups on the ground in a practical way that recognizes that we all benefit from healthy natural systems around us. And I think it goes without saying that we don't know what the consequences of this drought are going to be for farming, for the economy, for people, for cities throughout California. And as bad as that's going to be, it's a worse time to be a fish or a migratory bird. And so the kinds of challenges that our organization, other environmental organizations, and the regulatory agencies that are implementing laws like the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act all confront together is really putting us kind of in untested territory. And I think we acknowledge that. Fritz alluded to our partnership working with many agencies along the Sacramento River. We've been doing work along the Sacramento River for more than 20 years now. And so we've got a lot of experience there. And we need a whole lot of creativity, and that comes on both the water supply side, and we recognize that, and it also comes on the flood side. I think that one of the things we're learning is that we need some flexibility to make our systems work better, to make our natural systems work better. Part of that is figuring out how do we get more floodplain habitat, working with private landowners, not in a situation where we're seen to have adverse interests. And that's one of the challenges that we want to work on together too. So I think the answer to your question, Bill, is really we're just beginning. And in a practical way of addressing the challenges of what climate change means for us, we're literally on the ground floor right now.
So sort of a follow-up question is that with climate change, population growth, regulatory changes, the amount of water that that the state needs, either to reclaim or to capture, is increasing. So has the Nature Conservancy's outlook on surface water supply and needing to increase the amount of surface supply changed? Or is it evolving, or what is the outlook there?
Well, I have to say, I'm elated to be on a panel, which I'm the third speaker, and I've already heard the words groundwater and conjunctive water use twice from both of them. And I think that what it means is we have to get that vocabulary established outside of this room, for one thing. But beyond that, we've got to be a lot more creative about the kinds of storage that we're looking at as well. And I think that it's ironic that California has perhaps the most progressive set of law with respect to surface water resources, and we turn a blind eye to what we're doing with our groundwater. And there's an intrinsic connection between the two. And I think that we are learning this year that we've got to address this challenge, that we can't afford these sort of separate, disconnected realities. And so I think we're eager to work with the administrative agencies and the legislature to get a much better handle on monitoring and management of our groundwater resources, I think, is the first place. And the second thing is, the reason I raise that is from the conjunctive use projects, from reoperating our system in a much smarter way. All of that's going to require a much deeper understanding of our groundwater resources and its intrinsic link to the surface water resources that we do monitor, that we do monetize, and that we actually have a very active market. And so we have to put that equation together. And having said all that, yes, I think that we're painfully aware of the reality that I talked about at the top of this, which is that we have to better understand that we need to manage bigger storm intrusions when we aren't ready for them, and at the same time prepare for drought. And I think that does mean that we do need more storage. We need to have clear rules that we all agree on and how that surface storage is used. But I think that the whole system has to truly be integrated, and that should be, I think, our charge coming, going into this drought and coming out of it, whether it's a one-year drought or it's a multi-year drought. I think we all have to kind of plan and prepare on that basis.
Got it. Okay, very, very good. And so, Jim, we have this thing called the statewide water action plan. What are the components that have your attention and your members' attention that we ought to be looking at investment for that comprehensive solution that Jay is suggesting we need?
Well, the statewide water action plan is, I think, a work in progress in terms of what it really comprises. I've had some discussions with Department of Water Resources when they came out with their draft. I think it's got good principles. I think the goals are in line with what most of us would agree with. It's a little soft at this point on how you get from where we are to how we get from where they think we ought to be, from the standpoint that a lot of this is going to take some specific changes in law and legislation and in infrastructure. And particularly when you get to price point, talking about what it costs to do that, I think there's a lot of references to user pay and so on and so forth, but there's not really a lot of discussion yet about what kind of user pay systems we need. You don't have to be a rocket scientist. There's only so many ways to pay for water. I come from a transportation environment as well. I got into water a little later in the game. Transportation is a very arcane thing, you have to know a lot of acronyms, and you have to know how many different pots the funding can come from.
Good thing it's very different than water.
Yeah, what I was about to say, yes, was I thought it's difficult and complicated and Machiavellian and whatever you want to describe transportation, water trumps it every day. So I have a lot more scar tissue on water stuff, my involvement in water, than I ever got in transportation. I think the key for me is that, oh wow, this thing does work, but I don't know if I need it. The key for me is that we, to do what we need to do for a comprehensive plan, which we've heard a lot of reference to comprehensive water solution or dual goals. I mean, a lot of phrases that normal voters really probably don't know what the hell we're talking about, or maybe care as long as they turn the faucet and water's coming out and it's clean, they're going to be okay. The problem is those of us who work in this realize that there will come a day when that won't happen. And so we need to plan now. You don't get there from here overnight. We have a system in place now. It's a marvel from an engineering standpoint. It was built primarily for a state that had at the time probably 17, 18 million residents. Now we've got 38 million and rising, and we haven't done a whole lot from the 18 million level to the 38 million level to really take care of those needs, and that's the problem. So when you have a year like we've had this year, it doesn't take much for everybody to go into emergency mode because we don't have enough water now. And so our feeling is that we're pushing for a system, no matter all these solutions and all these needs that we're talking about, whether it's an environmentally driven need or a water supply driven need, in order to really get to the solution, you've got to have better infrastructure. If you don't have the infrastructure in place, then the fish are going to suffer. If you don't have the infrastructure in place, the farmers, the cities, people are going to suffer. Because we're not doing a good enough job in California right now capturing excess water in the wet years and making sure we're saving enough of it for the dry years. That's a simple concept, difficult to actually turn into reality. But in California, our solution is going to be inseparably connected with what voters want to do and what they're willing to pay for and how they're willing to pay for it, whether it's a voter or a water user. To me, most of them are the same people. It's just a matter of which pocket you're reaching into to pay for it. But and there's a lot of debate about whether voters or water users pay for different pieces of water solution. But the bottom line is we have to be able to describe the problem and put together a solution that actually shows people in very clear terms how additional storage, both surface and more effective water, groundwater storage, the right kinds of conveyance to get water from where we have it to where we need it, when we've got the water, so that when we don't have it, we've got some left to do something with, how we can do that, and what it's going to cost. And when you start talking about costs, we've done a lot of polling on this, the numbers really start to go down. Everybody gets it conceptually, but then when you start talking about, well, this is going to be an $18 billion thing, or this is going to be a $24 billion thing, then they start looking at it thinking, whoa, that's a lot of money.
So sort of as a transition, we'll do rapid fire, 30 seconds for this answer from all of you. The likelihood of a water bond.
Likelihood of a water bond, I think, I go back to what Jay was saying, this is the year to get it done. I think there will be a reasonably good chance we'll have a water bond this year.
Okay, Jay.
I agree, and I think that the key is flexibility, that a water bond allows us to implement a lot smarter water management strategies and put in place the right kinds of incentives to do conjunctive use projects, for example, and to respond to the environmental needs. So I think people are recognizing that more and more, and I agree with them. I think that the drought really helps drive that consciousness.
Fritz.
I'd heard the term once before as well, why waste a good crisis? I think there's a good chance it would pass.
Okay, Andy.
I think there's going to be a water bond, certainly in 2014. The question is, what's going to be in it? Is it going to be used to pay for statewide priorities? Is it going to have money for projects that make sense? There's a lot to decide. I think there's currently 7 water bonds at last count in the legislature. The question is, which ones survive? And I think that we need to be informed by the kinds of things that we're talking about here.
Right. So back to you on this comprehensive solution that you're looking at right now. So can you give us just a little bit more depth on some of the things that you're looking at in terms of the actual infrastructure? I understand that there might be 6 components, maybe detailing 1 or 2 of the components that you're looking at?
Yeah, I think I talked about conservation and recycling measures. There's a lot of opportunity, particularly in the American River Basin, for those. And so I always want to lead with those because in many ways it is sort of low-hanging fruit. But certainly for us in the Sacramento region, there's some fixes to be done at Folsom Reservoir. They have new flood control infrastructure in place now. It's going to allow the storage of more water, perhaps using that existing 1 million acre-feet more efficiently. Redesigning the operations of that reservoir for us is absolutely key because there's enhanced flexibility now there. And we need to use that flexibility to assume that every year that you go into it, every fall you go into is going to be, the next year is going to be a drought. Don't use all your water in the summer, don't use all your water in the spring. Assume every year is going to be a drought. And I think that designing those operations is a key priority for us. The regional interconnectedness infrastructure, the distribution systems within this place that allow the agencies to share water across jurisdictional boundaries is certainly key. I think there's a number of environmental projects that can be done, temperature control devices, for instance, at Folsom, to help the lower American River fishery, which really, for us, the water forum was all about helping that fishery while guaranteeing our future. Now it's time to finish that job. And certainly a Sacramento River diversion that allows us to switch from the American to the Sacramento and back as conditions warrant. As new infrastructure comes online in the Sacramento River Basin, we hope to take advantage of some of that and really plumb the region together.
And Andy, is that like a big pipe that runs from the Sacramento to the American with a bunch of lines coming off it?
No, that's a good question. Actually, what we feel like it is utilizing either some existing diversions that are currently used for agriculture or building a new diversion structure on the Sacramento River, in sort of like how Freeport was done by East Bay Mud in Sacramento County. Moving that water inland, treating it at a central location, and then distributing that treated water throughout the region, for all the way from the city of Sacramento, all the way to Roseville and Placer County Water Agency customers to the east. We think that centralized treatment really has a lot of economies of scale associated with it, and it's adaptable and it's scalable, and it gets away from having to write a huge check right up front. It lets us build into those things as the region grows.
So in energy, we talk about a smart grid because it's all connected and we have a better way of managing it. Are we moving to a smart grid for water?
I certainly hope so. I mean, I've seen nothing but progress with the regional water agencies, the cities and the counties that all are sitting in the room together, and a lot of them are here. What they've realized is nobody can do it alone in this region. It's impossible. We have to be well connected and as flexible as possible moving forward.
Okay, very good.
Can I add the
last point, and then we're gonna send it out to the audience.
In agriculture, we're trying to do some of the same stuff. The way we think that we can move the needle is better coordination and timing with our diversions on the river. Oftentimes, the fisheries agencies are releasing fish or water for a purpose, not talking to us about our diversions, and many times we can delay or speed up diversions in order to have a better outcome with wildlife.
Okay. Thanks, Fritz. So we want to turn to your questions. Do people have questions that we can circulate really quick and then I can read off?
Any more? Anyone?
This could be very simple.
While you're grabbing questions, I would like to comment on something that Andy said, because I think what he did was very well articulate the kinds of things that regional water, the regions can do if they have the resources. And to me, a successful water bond has got to have adequate money in it for the regional agencies to be able to tap that money on a matching basis and use it. There's other pieces of the water bond that have to be more on a statewide level, but that's a very important component that I think is essential to a successful water bond.
Okay. Very good. So I'm going to pose this question to you, Jay. So Pam asks, or Pamela asks a question, what point in time do you recognize as the natural or target state of the delta for wildlife populations? So I think the question is, we're entering a new era where climate change is basically changing the rules of the game, and we've operated under a certain set of conditions and expectations about, how fish and other wildlife are, what sort of water they need, but maybe the rules are changing. To what extent are our state policies keeping up with that?
Well, I think BDCP is an effort to try to keep up with that. I think that, like a number of your organizations around the room, and without implicating them, I see certain people in the room that we're actively working with on scientists or on science projects around BDCP and measuring, can this Bay Delta Conservation Plan and new infrastructure through the Delta meet its intended objective? And I think that from, without a whole lot of qualification, I can say among those who are tracking the science that the Nature Conservancy has been a part of, the answer is this is a really tough needle to thread, and that we need more operational flexibility, that it really above and below the delta. We need additional water resources in order to kind of deliver on the ability to improve ecological conditions in the delta. And we may be at a tipping point in the delta. I think that question infers that climate change really is swamping virtually every other factor, including level of diversion at some point, and I would agree with that. And I think that this is one of the things that we all really have to figure out, what does the delta mean to us? And it is a place where there is, it's more than just the convergence of the San Joaquin and the Sacramento. It is truly a unique place. We have radically altered what the delta looked like 150 years ago. It's a very different kind of habitat. But I think if you ask most Californians, they're going to say, wow, we'd still like to see salmon moving through the Sacramento River, and if possible to bring them back to the San Joaquin. And we'd really like to see migratory birds that are America's #1 recreational resource continuing as a vital part of the Delta, which they are today. And we're not going to get there in the status quo. We've got to do something differently. And I actually like the framework that Roger laid out earlier. I think that that three-part analysis of getting the infrastructure right, getting the operations right, getting to integrated policy and regulatory actions in the system is really kind of the critical path to look at to see if we can really solve that equation. And I think that's the place to start. And so I embrace your formula, and maybe we can come out with parallel conclusions there.
It was come up by a lot of greater minds than mine.
Any other comments from the panel before we take another question?
What we've seen trying to implement change with, especially the fisheries, is lack of adaptive management. Unfortunately, there's policies, and these policies were derived from our litigious community. If you don't do it, you're going to get sued. So the agency folks have to follow this rule book, and they know. We've had meetings where they're in the rooms, and they think that we could really move the needle if we were to try something different, but they're not allowed that flexibility. And I think Jay's, the Nature Conservancy, oftentimes are trying to make some of those changes, and they're meeting that with substantial resistance.
So one question we got from the group is a controversial one. Good thing, it's only water. Robert asked, there is this project that was on the books for a very long time, a project that was the twin to Folsom Dam. It's called Auburn Dam. And is it time for us to revisit that? Andy? Anybody want to take that question on?
Well, I'll say that at least the group that we've been working with, has really focused on things that we think are achievable locally with local cost shares that are very cost effective and deliver a fairly high yield that we can control. And the problem with a mega project, which is what Auburn Dam is, it's a mega project. It's a very, very expensive project, and it is clearly beyond the ability of local agencies to take on, either even in a small way or by themselves. And so our group has certainly been focused on, on big things, but biting off something like an Auburn Dam, at least for the local water supply agencies, it just seems like it's not feasible right now when there's all these other things that can be done in the area to get near. I mean, we talked about them, right? Recycling, conservation, just regional infrastructure, conjunctive use. These are all doable things that you can do one at a time or in combination together, and they're manageable. And that's in today's environment, today's economic environment, and certainly in today's sort of family budget, how do you pay for it environment? Those things that are scalable and you can bite off one at a time have much more attraction than sort of a mega project, at least in our view.
Okay. Jim, sorry, just pointing at you.
For probably as much or less money, you could get a lot more water if you were to just increase the height of Shasta Dam, and if you were to build a Sites reservoir. I mean, there's other places where you can get water. Yeah, it's a different river, but if we're going to do what Andy's talking about, the water is going to be accessible to a lot of other places. And I don't, I come from a construction industry background. I've been in it all my life. I remember the days when Auburn Dam was being supported. I remember the days when they started building it. I remember the days when the Friends of the River, started raising up the storm over it. The fact of the matter is, if you really look at the hard facts of Auburn Dam, and I'll probably get fired for saying this, but my folks are, I just don't think that the numbers support what the benefit is for that particular project. I'm not opposed to building a dam where you need to build it, but I don't know that that's the place to do it. I don't think that that's the place that will give you maximum benefit. You want to spend that kind of money on a water infrastructure project. Yeah, I realize that Shasta Dam has its own political issues, but the fact of the matter is, if I were king, that's where I'd be putting it. It's, the original Shasta Dam was meant to be a couple 100 feet higher than it is, and the reason they didn't build it is because they ran out of concrete, because they needed it for the war. It wasn't, so we could have had a Shasta Dam that was significantly bigger than it is now, and a reservoir that was significantly larger.
So I didn't know that story. So if you were to deploy the billions for an Auburn Dam towards Shasta, what are we talking about? Is that a $500 million to raise it, and how much higher does it go? Are there proposals on the table for raising Shasta?
Yeah, well, there's discussions, but there's a lot of, there's sacred Indian burial grounds up there, and there's a lot of other landowners up there that have an issue with it. And it's a federal project, so it's got federal rules that go beyond some of the things we can do. So it would be a complicated thing to accomplish, but if you were to, I'm just saying, if you were to be able to do that, you probably would get more bang for the buck.
So another question.
I just want to say, Bill,
Yeah.
so one, I'll endorse the remarks on Auburn Dam, and I think this cost-benefit test is something you don't just blow through. I think that there's a part of this also, we've only got so much money to solve the problems that are in front of us. And I think that the other part of this is we ought to start from places where we can achieve consensus and work forward. And I think Auburn might be one of the last places that you'd start if that's the way you're actually trying to go about reforming the system. And so I think we need to keep this in mind with the north-south dynamic and the bigger equation, that we ought to strive for areas where we can achieve consensus and make progress and build on that.
Okay. So we have another question, and this relates back to the water bond. So 3 interrelated questions. How big should it be? How important is continuous appropriation for storage? And the Bay Delta Conservation Plan anticipates a second water bond. It's part of its It's architecture. When would that be and how big would that need to be? So tough questions, right? So Jay?
I think that there's a need for at least, if you look at the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, that's a 50-year operating permit. And so we're going to need a number of investments in the system in order to much better integrate how we use, store, manage water for people in the environment between now and then. That said, so what's the right number? I don't know. It might be, I think, again, this is largely influenced by drought in reshaping a political climate in which many of us thought last year a water bond would be a 2016 issue rather than a 2014 issue. And I think you've heard all of us agree that we now think it's going to be in front of us in November and are working to that end. And I'm with Jim on this, that we're only going to get what the people are going to vote for. And so I think that's probably in the range of $10 billion, but that's a guess. And I think we'll have to work that out with the legislature and Governor Brown in the months ahead here. And I would say we're going to need at least 3 times that investment to do the kinds of things in reoperating our reservoirs, conjunctive use projects that enable us to recharge groundwater when we have surplus flows, and do all the smart things that we're thinking about doing in a way that's fair and equitable, that the people and water agencies will support. And so let's say, this water bond would be the beginning of a down payment of at least another $30 billion over the next 50 years, and frankly, I think I'm being conservative.
Jim and Andy?
There's a lot of, having been intimately involved in the existing water bond, that's where the scar tissue came from. We have done a really crappy job of framing what that water bond was about. Yeah, there's some warts in it. You know what? When you want to get votes from a legislator, it's funny what you do to get a vote. And so things kind of appear into it at the last minute that weren't part of the plan. But if you didn't do it, then you wouldn't have got the votes. So, it's part of it's a part of politics that isn't always that pretty. But the reality of that water bond, for the most part, and any future iteration that we might do with the one that ends up in 2014, is that none of that money was to be just handed out to anybody to increase water supply. It was to help offset or finance the environmental benefits, or what they described as the quote-unquote public benefits of a project, and that any additional benefits from a project that would increase water reliability, water supply, that was up for the regions or the agencies that were going to be benefiting from that project to come up with. And you know what? Nobody gets that. Not even some of the people across the street that are in the legislature. They somehow think it's going to just subsidize all of these projects. And that is not what that's not what the water bond was all about. There was a fundamental understanding that you can't always pinpoint who should pay for a particular environmental issue that has been created. I mean, you think of all the different things that have happened environmentally because of our water system. Again, I'd say the engineers did a fabulous job based on the understanding they had back then. Back then, it was all about how to get water from point A to point B and make sure there was enough of it. They weren't really thinking about fish or any of that kind of stuff that much. And so we've learned a lot since then. And there's a cost to that. There's a cost to making it better now and really taking care of all the environment. And I don't think you can pinpoint that cost to any particular region or city or demographic. It's really, we're all Californians, and it's just part of our job at this point to take care of that as part of the benefits. So that was the idea behind the water bond, that would kind of pool some taxpayer money for an environmental benefit.
Andy and then Fritz.
Just to say that I think that, how many more is it going to take? I think what the future of water bonding in California is going to absolutely be judged upon, did you do something with the last money you spent? And really, it does take that. We've passed several bonds in the last 2 decades, and while they've done a lot of good for a lot of small agencies, you can't go stake a sign into something that says this was paid for by the last bond. And I think even from just a symbology standpoint, it's important for California to finally do some big infrastructure things, and I think that we're running out of opportunities to do that. And I think this bond is an opportunity to do something big and be able to put a sign up and say this was paid for with the last water bond. That's what it'll take to keep Californians voting for investment in infrastructure.
In 2016
And beyond,
2018 and
absolutely.
Amen.
Fritz?
Sykes Reservoir needs about $1.8 billion for the public benefits portion. It's about a $4 billion reservoir. So when you take whatever that number is, whether it's $3 billion as some of the bonds are today, or the governor's $11 billion, 1.8. But I'm gonna challenge everyone here. So the private portion of Sykes Reservoir, the JPA and many people dreamed that this reservoir would be created, the locals would get it built, and that other portion, the private, would be purchased by folks south of the Delta for their needs and their obligations. But I'm challenging local people now. We need to be thinking about whether or not we don't want a piece of that pie. And in my district, we've been trying to do in lieu transfers with our neighboring districts, and everyone says it's too expensive. It's too expensive. They don't want to do the transfers. Lo and behold, this year's a drought year. They're willing to pay us 10 times what we were asking for last year for it. So what is water really worth to you? Not how little have you been paying, but to add value to your community, to your business, what is it really worth? That's the first question everybody has to ask themselves.
Yeah. All right. So I have 5 really good questions, but we're wrapping up. So in 30 speed round, in 30 seconds, we're going to go from this end and we're going to end with Andy. Final comments, things that you want to impart with this group, things that the North State Water Alliance ought to be thinking about and planning for if we're really going to generate that comprehensive solution that we all talk about.
Want to talk like a FedEx person or just? I think the key is that we can't just think of, I've heard a lot of good principles about what the North needs out of the final solution. I don't really know what some of those mean when you get right down to what does protecting all water rights mean? Does that mean you can do what you want with as you have with groundwater without any kind of impact? I think we're going to have to look at it. Bottom line is, water, like gasoline, will never be cheaper. It's never, the trend isn't going down; it's going up. And water is important to our economy and to our way of life. We're going to have to be willing to pay more for it if we want to get what we need.
Thanks, Jeff. Jay.
So I'm going to actually go back to one of the first concepts that came in the discussion, which was the importance of recognizing groundwater and treating it as a public resource. And I think that one of the things that we've seen, and Fritz is associated with probably one of the smarter water management agencies, the Old Flood and Conservation District, does an excellent job of monitoring its water basin and making sure that the basin is managed on a sustainable basis. And that, unfortunately today, folks, is the exception rather than the rule out there. And what I would say is, if you're sitting here as a Northern Californian, you need to say, we need to treat water as really an integrated resource. And that means we've got to pay attention to groundwater. And what that means for us is we'll avoid situations of extreme overdraft. We'll have opportunities for groundwater banking. You won't have saltwater intrusion in the groundwater table. We avoid subsidence of the ground. And the opportunities go on and on. But we need to kind of work together to figure out what's the right approach here. I think we recognize that the best approach is to make this work locally, give agencies the tools they need to monitor, to manage those systems right, and then figure out what is the right role for the state of California if those conditions don't happen. But I would just argue in this room that this is something that we need to be creative about. All of us, everybody in this part of California, really in Southern California as well, have a huge stake in really addressing groundwater reform this year as part of the equation.
Thanks, Jay. Fritz?
On that note, it's about awareness. Everyone's very aware right now of groundwater, of surface water. We can't lose this opportunity. We have to continue to communicate with our constituents, also with the other agencies that we work with, our neighboring agencies, to make certain that we can always be wise managers of this resource.
So I think for the North State Water Alliance, I've watched it evolve over the last 5 years, and we've gone from a group that was against something to being a group that's for something, and that's a big difference. And so for us, what it means for us is it's incumbent upon us for the solution in 3 parts to have specific policy and regulatory recommendations around infrastructure, around operational security, and around regulatory reform to recognize what the future is going to bring us. I think we're doing that extremely well now, and we need to continue to do that because I think we've got to get better as a state rather than the way we used to do things, which was try to get better as one agency or one city. We're in it together. Clearly, the governor has his eye on this. The legislature is active on it. For us, staying together and having a coordinated solution is probably the most important thing I can think of.
So one final question for you, though. So people in the audience might be wondering, when are we going to see this solution in 3 parts, right? So do you have sort of a timetable, and is it something that's going to kind of come out in levels of detail?
Yeah. As I mentioned, especially the infrastructure piece is difficult, right? We're trying to cram years and years, decades of engineering into something that makes sense for the region in a very short time period. I think 2014 is going to be really focused on wholesome operations for us, developing that regional infrastructure package in time for this legislative session. So we're out there with that. Regulatory reform is going to take time. I think Dean is going to talk about that today. It is a tremendously important piece, but there's a lot of moving parts to it, and I think that one's going to be the one that's going to develop sort of organically. But infrastructure and operations, I think 2014 is our year.
All right, excellent. Please join me in thanking our panel.